Hi, everyone. Lauren Culp here, President and CEO at CUInsight.com. And I'm bringing you a 3 questions video interview today with a really special guest. We're going to be talking about cybersecurity and AI, some really important topics for credit unions. Joining me is Karen Postma. She's the Managing Vice President at PSCU Co-op Solutions. Really excited for our conversation. Karen, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited too.
Let's dive right into our first question. The world is changing really fast around us. And in this digital enabled world that we found ourselves in, the rise of artificial intelligence has really become a powerful tool. But the same technology is also being used by cyber criminals for malicious purposes too. So as AI has become really sophisticated, more accessible, how are cyber criminals really using it to commit cyber crimes, cyber fraud, other financial crimes?
Yeah, it's a great question, and kind of there's two components to that actually is, even if you say the technology is parallel to ours, there is a component in which, as legitimate businesses who have, social fiscal responsibilities, we utilize technology in a certain way that complies with those, should I say, controls or barriers, where fraudsters can utilize the same technology, but they don't have those barriers, right? They don't have the social constraints. They don't have the legislative constraints and so forth. So even on the same playing field with the same technology, fraudsters, because of the lack of moral compass, effectively have a advantage in how they deploy types of AI. With that being said, we are seeing various forms of AI being used, such as, one of the biggest fraud trends that we have is bin attacks or brute force attacks, depending on, how you say it. And effectively, fraudsters are leveraging machine learning in an effort to be able to get to valid cards and card credentials in a much more expedited time frame, and then leveraging robotics to help execute on that. That allows them to go undetected. Some of the more sophisticated, and I know everybody's heard of ChatGPT, but really where that's playing havoc in our space is fraudsters are leveraging ChatGPT to more write phishing emails. So historically, we've been able to tell our members, hey, look for these anomalies, make sure that, the phrasing is correct, that there's not misspellings and those kinds of things. Well, when fraudsters leverage ChatGPT, English doesn't have to be their primary language or their main language. That ChatGPT is actually writing the email for them, which allows it to go more undetected. And also quite even, I think a little bit more alarming is ChatGPT is being leveraged to write code for such things as keyloggers. So again, you don't necessarily have to have a technical background in order to commit this type of fraud. And then last but not least, what we're seeing is generative AI just starting to being dabbled in to execute on some of these frauds, but effectively being able to take somebody's voice, maybe a family member, and call them and get information, and it's really the fraudster that's talking, but using AI to make it sound like a family member. All these are really a little bit unnerving in my mind, and so that's why I think it's important that we kind of keep on top of them and make sure that we're all aware of how that AI is being leveraged.
Some of the things you're talking about are kind of scary or like sci-fi movie sounding, but really, really important to have this conversation and for credit unions to stay on the leading edge and be there for their members, especially as what we might have relied on for so many years as kind of a legacy line of defense might be becoming less reliable. You're talking about, we used to be able to say these things, but those don't maybe apply anymore. So what can credit unions do to protect their members?
Yeah, and this question has actually become more tricky, as a lot of this AI has been deployed, both from combating fraud to preventing fraud. Because as we layer in various forms of AI and detection, the fraudsters understand that, their transactions are going to get caught, going to get stopped. And so now what they're doing is they're focusing on what I'm going to quote unquote deem the weakest link in the chain, and that is our member. And so effectively, fraudsters are socially engineering or convincing the member, give me your OTP, or say that that is not fraud, or respond to that text that it is not fraud. So, quite honestly, in order to protect their members, what I'm telling credit unions is the biggest thing you can do is education. Education to your members about how fraudsters are perpetrating fraud, but also around, various other just things in general around, what is fraud? Because sometimes fraudsters are convincing members that what they're doing, if they're participating in the fraud, that that isn't a crime, and it is, right? And when we talk about education, it's not the traditional email campaign or maybe post on your website. I think we have to get really creative. So, all the forms of social media, because that Generation Z is really the target right now for some of the fraudsters, because they're able to more socially engineer them because they've lived in this digital space. And so them responding or interacting is second nature, and they don't even stop and think about it. The other is engaging other traditional media outlets in campaigns. Also, this was brought up to me in a group setting, is maybe even community groups. And this is where I think credit unions can really excel, because they have that force within the communities, whether that's church groups or other community groups, to educate and use that as your platforms for education as well. I would say that when I look at fraud in general, there's a lot of fraud that is effectively being stopped with the tools that are being deployed, but it is then being approved and or confirmed. And then the fraud happens after. And that happens to be really where, as a community, I think we have an opportunity from an education standpoint.
That's so true. And one of the things I'm really curious about, we know consumers have a really high expectation for their experience, for whether it's a digital experience, in-person experience, but everyone wants something seamless and something really positive. But then on the flip side, you have this need for security. And I think we've all had the experience where it's like, okay, I've had to get a, two-step verification and multi-factor authentication, my phone, I get a text message, I get an email, I get a phone call, I have a number. Well, how can credit unions really balance the need to both prevent the financial crimes, protect their members, prevent the cyber attacks, but still ensure a more seamless and positive member experience?
One of the keys in the strategy around member experience, in my mind, is consistency. Sometimes I think that we get caught up in a specific direction within the credit union, and it guides us either one extreme or the other. And that inconsistency helps the fraudsters perpetuate some of the things that we previously talked about. So I think consistency in how you create that experience is really good. So setting a standard and baseline at the credit union around false positive ratio, impact numbers, those kinds of things, I think is a really good baseline to say, okay, here's what we as an organization agree that we will tolerate from that experience perspective and how we will work through it. The other component to that is leaning into the idea of segmentation. So, a one size shoe fits all is maybe the best approach. If you have high net worth consumers, you might treat them differently than you treat a different segment of your population versus a different segment of your population. We've talked about that a lot of times from our rewards and, even branding standpoint a lot of times within credit and debit cards. However, I don't know that it is as readily talked about in the fraud space, but it's very applicable. The other is just making sure that we're staying ahead of in understanding technology that's available, and truly looking to understand how we can deploy technology in order to be able to execute on maybe a little bit more stringent fraud experience. So an example of that is if you have the opportunity to deploy notifications to your member as soon as possible, as soon as that transaction happens, that might, even though you're declining at point of sale, that still might be a better experience for the member. It might be tolerable versus you consuming the fraud because you can't get a notification out to them right away. So just things to kind of consider in that balance.
Well, so many good insights for credit unions, and it's a real imperative for us to figure out as the world evolves around us, how we continue to evolve to protect our members. Karen, as we wrap up the conversation, do you have any final thoughts for our audience or final asks for our listeners today?
I would just say, this is an evolving space. Fraud always seems to be, but the rapid speed in which technology, specifically AI, is evolving and how that is impacting not only our members, but how we prevent fraud, how the fraud is being perpetrated, is moving at a pace that we have never seen in the industry. So I think, continued education within our industry, continued engagement from your partners is always a great opportunity to stay ahead of it and be able to make informed decisions for your credit union that best fits.
Well, that is just a perfect way to finish up the conversation. We're going to link here to Karen's contact information and that of the team at PSCU Co-op Solutions. So if anyone is interested in learning more or leveraging the resources they have, we will have that all linked for you in the post here. Karen, thank you so much for taking some time to share your insights with us today. I know I learned a thing, and hopefully we'll get to run into you in person here soon.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the time today.
Thanks so much. And thanks for everyone for tuning in to our 3-question video interview series, and we'll be back again next time.